My name is Jack Southern. I am here representing the Metropolitan and South Eastern CIWEM committees today. Very pleased to have organised this event, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all here. Just giving people a moment or two to join us from the waiting room. Thank you all for dialing in early before we introduce today's speaker and a little bit about the talk today. I'm also just going to keep talking to make sure that you've got your speakers working, because that's always fun on a webinar. And thank you for giving up your lunchtime today to join us. Okay, I'm just going to keep just start off with the introduction then, and we'll keep an eye on the attendees number just to see how once it levels out. So, as I say, very pleased to welcome you all here today to join us for this webinar. It's really topical as well. Thank you. Given that we are in Mental Health Awareness Week, so very pleased to be talking about a very prominent issue with that. We'll go into that more in a second, but just to set out the housekeeping. So we have the chat function. So if you're having any technical difficulties, please do post a message into the chat, and someone will assist you with that. If you've got any questions, we're going to be holding a Q&A session at the end, so please do put them in the Q&A box. Feel free to post them as they come up into your mind, and we'll save them up in the Q&A box. And Neil's very kindly agreed to take those at the end. So the chat is for technical issues, and the Q&A is for your questions to Neil, please. We are recording the event, and to final confirmation at the end that we will be posting it as well on the CIWEM YouTube channel. So do have a look on the CIWEM YouTube channel for past recordings of previous events that may be interested to you. A couple of future events, just while I've got your attention and we're seeing people finally finish signing in, to flag for your attention, we have CIWEM have organised a training course on urban wellbeing, which links very well to the theme of nature for this year's Mental Health Awareness Week. So do have a look at the CIWEM training pages if that is of interest to you, and it's links around how urban design can support urban wellbeing as well. There's also, we have Flood and Coast Conference coming up, where we'll be talking around a range of themes as well. So do have a look either again at the CIWEM website or the specific Flood and Coast Conference website. Okay, I think that's probably enough time for most people to join. So I will start off with our introductions again. So I'm very pleased to welcome Neil Peters here today from Nuthatch Consulting. I've known Neil for a number of years and followed his work in the suicide prevention area. And it's really a pleasure to have him here with us today for as part of our Mental Health Awareness Week and as part of CIWEM's wellbeing series of webinars. I think as a society, I was reflecting on this, that and as an industry, we've got a lot better at talking about wellbeing and mental health, but there are still issues around it that are taboo, and I think perhaps suicide is one of the bigger issues of that. So it's a really important opportunity today to talk about it in a safe and open way and improve our own understanding of it, so that we're more comfortable about talking about this topic and integrating it into our work. I'll hand over to Neil now to introduce himself. But as I say, if you've got any questions, please do post them in the Q&A, and then I'll be back at the end of the talk to ask your questions to Neil. Okay, over to you, Neil. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. I'm sorry, my chair's super creaky. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really kind of you to invite me today to talk through this topic. Let me move on to my first slide. So as Jack said, I'm Neil Peters, and I set up Nuthatch Consultants last summer. Just to give you sort of a bit of background to me, really, I actually have had a slightly unusual career path. I actually used to work in transport planning for Mott MacDonald, a company many of you will know, I'm sure, a multidisciplinary engineering company. I worked on a number of large infrastructure schemes, Crossrail, London Olympics, Thames Gateway Bridge, Croydon Tram, and more some sustainable transport schemes and local schemes, cycle schemes and traffic and parking schemes. And also was seconded to Transport for London for a while during that period as well. So I do have a sort of understanding of maybe some of the organisations that you guys might be working for, and perhaps some of your clients. So I worked there for 6 or 7 years, and then I moved into the charity sector, and it ended up at Samaritans. Many of you will know Samaritans is sort of probably the UK's leading suicide prevention charity. It's well known for its helpline. So I joined there as a project officer, working on a partnership they have with the railway to reduce suicides on railways. So I was at Samaritans for 10 years in a number of roles, starting in that rail team, moved around a little bit, and then finishing up as sort of strategic program manager for the partnership with the railway to reduce suicides on railways. So I've got a good grounding in suicide prevention working at Samaritans. Last summer, I left Samaritans and decided to set up as a sort of freelance consultant working in suicide prevention primarily. I really wanted to take what I'd learned really at Samaritans and that knowledge of suicide prevention and take it out to new audiences. I'd seen when I was at Samaritans there were opportunities for perhaps working in a smaller partnership way with charities and businesses that had an interest in suicide prevention, perhaps didn't want a major partnership with a big charity, but had some need for advice or consultancy around suicide prevention. So I've been doing that since the summer. Here's a few of the organisations that I've worked with or are working with, and I've been primarily doing either programme management on suicide prevention programmes. I did a big piece of work with the National Suicide Prevention Alliance, setting up a programme for them to involve people with lived experience of suicide, as well as giving advice around suicide prevention strategies or reviewing strategies that people have already got for their organisations or sites. So that's kind of a bit of the background to me and where I've come from. Much of my sort of knowledge and expertise is really around suicide prevention in public places, drawing on that knowledge from my work on the railway. So I'm going to try and cover a bit of some of that today. Before we sort of get going in all of this, I really sort of wanted to highlight that, you know, suicide is an emotive topic. It is a difficult one to talk about. You know, there will be people on the call today that have been personally affected by suicide. They may have lost people. They may have had suicidal feelings themselves. And I just wanted to make people feel comfortable in this space that, you know, if you are affected by anything that we talk about today, you know, do take a moment out, step away from the computer if you need to. And at the end of the seminar, you know, if something has affected you, do reach out to a friend or a family member or a colleague, and you share how you've been feeling, because I think it's really important to kind of offload if you've been affected by anything. Of course, if you don't have someone you feel comfortable talking to, there are lots of organisations out there that will provide emotional support. I'm very familiar with Samaritans, and you can call their helpline 116123 or contact them in a number of other ways, which they advertise on their website. You might not have heard of Hub of Hope, but that's a website you can go to and you can search for local support for a whole range of mental health and emotional support issues. So do check that out if that interests you as well. Also, we're going to be talking a bit about suicide statistics and other elements of suicide. And I wanted to sort of drive home the point that although we might be talking about these sort of headline figures, behind all of those is, you know, an individual has lost their life, and the people around them, their friends and family, would have lost that person as well. So it's really important to remember that there's, you know, a life at the heart of what we're talking about, and the things that I want to talk about today are hopefully going to go on to help people reduce the impact of those suicides and reduce suicide. But it's really important to remember that we are talking about individuals, even if we're talking about numbers. It leads me nicely on to some numbers. I just wanted to give you a bit of context to suicide in the UK and in Britain, and I don't know how familiar people that tuning in today will be with the numbers of suicides, but there's around 6,000 suicides in the UK every year. I've got some stats on the screen for England and Wales, and the latest data that we have confirmed is from 2019. It takes a long time for the suicide stats to be confirmed by ONS coming through from coroners and so on. In the numbers for 2019 saw a rise of over 300 in England and Wales from the previous year. Many of you may know that men are 3 times as likely to take their own lives as women, and often suicide prevention measures are really focused on that demographic, particularly men in their middle years. The highest rate for suicide is for men 45 to 49, and for women it's for that same middle years, but for 5 years older. Interestingly, I don't know if any of you do any work in the Republic of Ireland, but actually suicides continue to fall there, which is sort of contrary to the situation in the UK at the moment. And much of what we're going to be talking about today is trying to prevent suicides in public places, and around 30% of suicides are in a public place as opposed to a sort of private home. Just to put a bit of context into those big numbers, those latest figures, although people in the middle years tend to be the largest demographic for suicide, we did see a rise in under 25s, particularly driven by a rise in suicides amongst females under 25. And actually the stats in 2019 showed that was now the highest rate ever for females under 25. So that's really a group of people that we need to keep an eye on around suicide. As I mentioned, suicides have begun to rise in 2018, and we had seen falling suicides since 2013. So 2018 would sort of buck that trend, and that was driven overall by a rise in male suicides. We have seen some provisional data for 2020, and that, the numbers at the moment do indicate actually a reduction in suicide from the previous year. But we need to sort of be a bit careful about those stats because there's been delays of data coming through from coroners' inquests. I think that's COVID related delays. But I think the real-time surveillance does suggest there hasn't been a particular increase during the pandemic in line with recent trends. So there's something to keep an eye on. We do know obviously that risk factors for suicide have increased during this difficult time. Increases in loneliness and isolation, economic challenges for people, rises in domestic violence and substance misuse, in particular. All the things that you might associate with social or health challenges, there's been a lot of pressure on those things, obviously, over the last year, and we may see a bit of a lag time in seeing what the impact of that might be, but that may be coming, although it's important to reassert that we haven't seen that come through as yet. I know many of you work in the southeast of England, and we did see a significant rise in suicides, particularly amongst men, from 2018 to 19 as well, from 100,000 to 16.8. My next slide just shows a bit of context for that in England and Wales. And actually, South East has one of the lower suicide rates across the country. Suicide rates tend to be higher in areas of deprivation. You see London's at the lowest one, and South East not far behind. We do see high rates in Yorkshire and Humber in the northeast, and down in the southwest as well. This is the long-term trends for suicide. You can see I'm sort of in stark contrast there, really, the male rate per 100,000 compared to the female rate. I should say I've lifted these stats from Samaritan's suicide statistics reports, and if you want to delve into any of this data in more detail, Samaritan is a really good source for this. They do sort of dissect the ONS stats and make it relevant to suicide and suicide prevention. So if you want to know a bit more about the context for that, they look at the UK as a whole, as well as looking at the individual nations and the Republic of Ireland as well. So there's some useful sort of analysis there if you want to look at it in any more detail. I don't want to talk about method of suicide in too much detail, but I think it's important to understand as part of suicide prevention in public places about how people do attempt to take their life. And actually, in the UK, England and Wales in particular, hanging and strangulation, suffocation tends to be biggest method of suicide. There are other methods noted there, including drowning, falls and fractures, poisoning, and jumping or lying in front of a moving vehicle and using a sharp object. And that's sort of listed out in that table on the left-hand side there. Sorry if I'm getting a bit croaky. The kids are back at school now and spreading the germs around, which is not great. That table on the right-hand side, I've just lifted from some work that I've done recently with a major landowner in England that the land is publicly accessed. And the stats just differ slightly from the national picture. I just wanted to sort of demonstrate that you know, things could be site-specific or environment-specific, and actually fall from height for this landowner was particularly prevalent. So it's important to look at sites in their own context, really. So why should we take action? Why should we, you know, take action about suicide prevention, particularly those of you that don't work in suicide prevention directly? And you know, I know you're working in environment and water schemes. But those of us that work in the sector recognise that, you know, suicide is everyone's business. We can all play our parts in reducing suicide. It isn't inevitable, but it is complex. Some of the things that I talked about earlier about what's driving suicide and some of those risk factors are complex, and you know, there's not a single measure that will reduce those, and therefore, you know, you can't reduce suicide as an individual or as one organisation, but most effective suicide prevention programs are those that see a multi-agency approach where different organisations are working together, you know, bringing in local authorities and the police and health authorities and perhaps local third sector organisations, as well as sort of landowners and other private sector individuals as well. So a really sort of advocate for that multi-agency approach. I think suicide and suicide prevention are topics that are really kind of growing in their sort of understanding and public understanding, and people are talking about it a lot more. I mean, there's still a stigma about this work, but I think organisations are starting coming to realise that they do have a sort of ethical responsibility to support vulnerable people that come onto their jurisdictions, and not only supporting, you know, people that come onto their sites, but supporting their staff as well. Clearly, suicide prevention reduces the loss of life and saves lives. And it also prevents the trauma for those around them. We often talk about the ripple effect of a suicide and how there's many, many people that are affected by a suicide when someone takes their own life. And, you know, friends and family are perhaps an obvious one, but then health services will get involved, the emergency services, perhaps a landowner or staff that were involved on the site where someone died, bystanders or witnesses that might have seen it. So there's that whole group of people around that might also be affected and traumatised by that situation. And we do know that anyone that's been affected by a suicide is potentially at greater risk of suicide themselves. So by reducing the suicides and reducing the trauma, we're also reducing potential suicides further down the line as well. Some sites do build up a reputation for being a place where people are taking their life, and we call them perhaps locations of concern. And and that does create a reputational risk for an organisation. So people, they want to do more around suicide prevention to reduce that risk. For those of you that are working on schemes in public places, you might be able to build in suicide prevention into your scheme. So being able to, you might not be working on a suicide specific scheme, but it might be that you can build in value to your clients by involving suicide prevention measures in your schemes. And do get in touch with me if you want to know more about how you can do that. So on to the measures. From a sort of strategic level, there's three really key areas to focus on. I've just had a flash up saying I've got unstable internet, so hopefully you can all still hear me. So as I say, there's three key areas. Prevention is really key. So to reaching people upstream from that moment of crisis, trying to prevent people reaching a point where they actually want to take their own lives. Then crisis intervention, that's actually intervening at the point where individuals have reached crisis and want to take their own life and attempt suicide. And that might be the area that actually impacts maybe some of the work that you might be doing or things you can do in your schemes in particular. We'll talk a lot more about that shortly. And then post-vention, that's reducing the impact of that suicide, as I said earlier, reducing that trauma around a potential suicide. So sort of focusing a bit more then on that crisis intervention and what we can do at that point where someone might be wanting to take their own life. How do we stop that person taking it at that point? So we can restrict access to a site and the means of suicide. By closing a site completely, obviously you can reduce that risk. That's not always practical, but there might be things you can do around that in terms of closing certain elements and so on that might reduce it. Increasing the opportunity and capacity for human intervention. Now, I'm a really big advocate for human contact, and I really believe that that's probably the strongest suicide prevention measure is to increase that human contact, increase opportunities for people to see people in crisis and therefore make an intervention. Also increasing opportunities for help seeking by the individual, and we'll talk more about that shortly. And again, changing the public image of the site, reducing the impact of it being known as a site where someone can take their own life, and it actually just generally improving the aesthetics of it. So how do we restrict access? Some of these might be obvious, some of these might not have occurred to you before, but as I say, you can restrict access to certain areas. It might be that in a multi-storey car park, for example, you might want to reduce the number of high stories or repurpose them for other measures. It might be that in a remote site, you might want to close the car park or reduce access to it at night or something like that. Fencing is a really effective measure at certain sites. The Public Health England guidance is that fences should be 2.5 metres high and inwardly curved. This means that it's harder for people to climb up a fence. But also, if people get beyond the fence line, they can actually get back if they want to. Bridge barriers, safety nets can be really important, and actually they can be multi-purpose as well. So if you're working at a cliff site or a quarry and you want to prevent rock falls and you're using a safety net, that can also have a two-fold approach for reducing suicide as well. Boundary marking is an interesting one. It doesn't provide a physical barrier, but there is a psychological barrier. You would have seen hatching and painted lines on railway platforms, and people know they shouldn't be in those areas, and bystanders know that if people are in that area, they shouldn't be there as well. And so it really highlights when people are in the wrong area. Also, vegetation can be really effective. You see that there's a photo on the slide there of some gorse bushes next to a pathway at a cliff top, and you can build in vegetation that's pleasing to the eye, isn't a big ugly barrier, but actually can be used effectively to root people away from a method of suicide. That can be really effective as well. Lighting obviously plays its part. Just to talk about the photos on the slide very quickly. That slide in the middle, there's a scheme in the West Country for a bridge scheme. You can see the barriers there. Perhaps not the most aesthetically pleasing, but effective for reducing access to the bridge side. The other bridge scheme there with the pink lighting is a scheme in Northern Ireland. It's actually part of a wider arts regeneration scheme, but they put in an arts installation as part of the barrier for the bridge. I believe the lights can change colour as well, and so I'll talk maybe a bit more about that shortly. But you don't necessarily have to have an ugly scheme to create a barrier. This is a scheme developed by Knight Architects for the London Olympic Park, and you can see that it's a relatively high bridge. This is a pedestrian walkway, I should say, and it's curved, but it's got big wide sight lines. It's big, light and airy. It doesn't necessarily have to be a big ugly boxy bridge over a railway. That's another interesting one. This is an example. As I mentioned, human intervention, it's really important that you can make contact with people and people can see people in crisis. So if you're doing an infrastructure scheme, try and build in visibility, design it in. So that might be a bridge scheme that has long sight lines. It might be a station that doesn't have pillars on it. Somewhere that you can't have hiding places. Is really important. CCTV can be really effective, but it's really important that it's monitored so that staff identify if someone's in the wrong place and make an intervention. I've seen schemes where smart CCTV or thermal CCTV have been used. Smart CCTV can be used, for example, if someone's strayed into an area they shouldn't be in, it might trigger an alert to staff, or it might trigger an announcement to tell someone to move out of that area. And if they don't, then perhaps staff can make an intervention. The thermal cameras can maybe be used in more remote locations, in a wood location where maybe individuals are less likely to be spotted by bystanders or staff. But again, it's really important that these are all monitored, either through alerts or by actively monitoring. And if you are asking staff or other people to make interventions, and those people need to be equipped to deal with that situation. There's lots of different training models out there. I mean, I'm very familiar with the Samaritans. They offer training to organisations, but there's another training called Assist, and there's other organisations that deliver suicide prevention training as well. And what you really want staff to be able to do is identify people in crisis, start a conversation with them, talk to them about how they're feeling, get them to a place of safety, and then perhaps pass them on to another organisation that can help them further. And I would always advocate, trying to encourage people to look out for each other, whether that's, building a staff culture, having a campaign for bystanders to look out for one another. It's really important that everyone takes that kind of suicide is everyone's issue. Creating opportunities for people to seek help themselves is really important. We talk about putting up crisis signage at areas of concern. In the UK, people do tend to use Samaritan signage because it's a national helpline. It's available 24/7, and there aren't too many other emotional support lines that are available around the clock. So that's useful to use Samaritans. So those signs can be put up on fences and posts and other locations where people might dwell when they're thinking about taking their own life. Some areas, some schemes have used emergency telephones as well. There's sort of pros and cons to that. They do require maintenance and reasonably high setup costs, but they can be very effective in reducing suicide, particularly in areas where mobile phone reception isn't strong. And then, of course, general advertising of support for individuals. So it might be promoting a Samaritans campaign or other charities that provide emotional support, or encouraging people to seek help through their GP or by talking to friends and family. Just a couple of bits of information about schemes that I'm aware of. So in the US, there was a bridge scheme that installed crisis telephones, and of 39 people intending to take their own life, 30 used the phone to call for help, and only one of those went on to take their own life. So they can be really effective. There's some stats around a scheme in the south of England that put in signage in the car park and reduced the suicides there from 10 per year to just over 3. And all of these measures can have an impact on their own, but really they need to be part of a holistic strategy that builds in lots of different measures to be really effective. I would say that many schemes that I'm aware of through my work, people don't always build in evaluation into them. Broadly speaking, we think they're effective, but if you are putting in suicide prevention measures, it's really important to try and build in budget for evaluation as well, which will help understand what is effective. I won't go through all of these in detail, but you'll see there that some of these measures are more effective than others. Physical barriers and physical barriers at jump sites are really powerful, and signage and crisis signage as well. There's some bits around using safety nets there, and these are just drawing on some data that from NICE guidance and other studies. In terms of improving the image from a site, I talked a bit earlier about the reputation of a site, and there are locations around the country that build up. They always become iconic locations for suicide, but some of them do build up a sort of mythology around them as well. I worked on a location in the East Midlands that became known as a real location where I think there was a quote, "This is where everyone goes to take their own life." But actually, there's only been 2 or 3 suicides there, and actually, the location that people were talking about wasn't even the site that where the suicides were. It was a site further away. So it's really important that people talk responsibly about suicide, and the sort of advent of social media and so on, these things can spiral out of control. So it's really important to try to dampen down that conversation. And there are guidelines in particular for media around how they report on suicide. And if you want to know more about that, do drop me a line. But working with media outlets, particularly local media, to responsibly is important. In terms of the aesthetics of the site, we know that there are sort of 2 things that drive people to suicide from a sort of an aesthetic point of view. There are lots of reasons why people might choose a location for suicide, but there are 2 things around how they look. One is that they are lonely and unwelcoming places, and actually that it's less likely to be an intervention or come across other people or affect other people, and that is appealing to some people as a place to take their own life. Others are attracted to beauty spots, that kind of iconic romantic sense of a location as well. So we do know that sort of generally improving those less attractive sites can have an impact on suicide. And there's a study by Dr. Lisa Mazzano and colleagues 5 years ago where they looked at reasons why people were choosing a certain type of location for suicide. And they spoke to a number of people that had attempted to take their own life. And they said that they felt that if locations could be redesigned or adapted to make them feel less isolated and more humane, then they would be less appealing to people who want to take their own life. So that's something to think about. And I've seen schemes where they've installed art installations, a bit like photo there is the bridge again from Northern Ireland. But I've seen local schemes where schools have maybe done some collages or things for the station. Just having a station adoption scheme where the local community take ownership of it and give it a sense of this belongs to the community, and they might install flowers or planters. I know I think there's a station in South London that Samaritans adopted some of the planters and put flowers in there, but also put on their helpline number and things, and because the volunteers were often there looking at and doing the gardening, they were available to speak to people as well. Which brings me nicely on to something that was touched on earlier by Jack, that is Mental Health Awareness Week this week, and the theme is nature and connecting with nature. And I think it's really important that we give access to nature to people, and it does have a real benefit for health and well-being. And with your environmental and water schemes, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted, but if you can give access to the public to nature through those schemes, you're contributing to suicide prevention in itself, because you're improving people's well-being, and hopefully having an impact further upstream from that moment that reaches crisis. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some of the things you can do around designing in suicide prevention, particularly in public places. And there's lots more you can do. I haven't really talked about the operations of the site and more about helping individuals and so on. But all of these measures need to come together as part of a sort of holistic package when you're working at a site to reduce suicide. So, if you do want to know more about some of those things that we talked about, do drop me a line. My details are on the screen. I'm on LinkedIn, and my website is up there as well. So do get in touch if you're interested in finding out more. And I think Jack is going to curate a few questions if there has been any, but do drop your questions into the Q&A box if you've got any questions and wanted to ask me anything.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, for that excellent talk there. As Neil suggested, if you do have any questions, please do pop them into the Q&A box. We've still got a good amount of time left to go through a range of them. I'm just thank you again for that, and reiterate what Neil suggested at the beginning. If you have been affected by anything that we've talked about today, please do reach out to one of those resources. And what I suggested at the beginning about this is a really important topic to talk about. So please do think about, even if you've not been personally affected by the message, do please share that and do try and have a conversation with a colleague or a co-worker to promote the understanding and debate and discussion around this as an important area for discussion. Okay, I'm going to move to the questions and answers then as through the chat. So our first question is, what successes have planners had with people-centered measures, working with artists and engaging with the local community to prevent suicides?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, I don't have any particular stats to hand around that, but I do know from my time with Samaritans working on the railway that there were a number of locations of concern that the railway were working with local communities to build in art schemes, whether it's kind of getting kids to do a mural or something like that, or installing art, or just trying to make the aesthetics of a station better, or getting those station adoption schemes and working with community rail alliances to try and build those up. I think it's quite an intangible thing in some ways to measure that, because the statistics for those types of sites tend to be quite low. But I think they can be part of the wider sort of strategy for that particular station or location as well. So perhaps don't always pin those things to a suicide prevention scheme, but suicide prevention can be a contributory benefit to some of those things, I think.
Excellent, thank you. And then another question is about the design process. So when looking at, for instance, major infrastructure schemes, at what point would you involve suicide prevention as a consideration as part of the design?
I think at the start, really, it's in some ways it's quite hard to retrofit some measures, and it can end up being more expensive. I think if those considerations are built in from the start, things like removing a pillar or removing places to hide are difficult to build in retrospectively. So actually, if you're thinking about that from the start, it's really important. I mean, other things can be added, things like safety nets and fencing can be added to things later on. But actually, if you're thinking about it right at the start, even if it's something that isn't built right at the outset, I think it's really important. Definitely, and you know, there's lots of guidance around things that you can do around that. So.
And that segues quite nicely into another question about the way to go about risk assessment and within for asset owners and operators, and the opportunity to identify opportunities for retrofit. You mentioned that might be a challenge, but how would that go?
Yeah, I think for existing schemes, you need to look at what the current situation is. Drawing on local statistics around suicide and suicide attempts, or the presentation of vulnerable people. For any given site, the numbers can be relatively insignificant from a statistical point of view. Obviously, you know, any life lost is devastating, but looking at that more holistically and looking at those vulnerable people that are presenting is really important as well, because that can often provide much richer data. So you might have 1 or 2 suicides a year at a particular location, but you may have 10, 20, 30 people presenting at that location, and that gives you much more of a steer of whether that's a real risk location or not. And try and look at statistics over a number of years as well. We tend to look at 3 or 5 year statistics rather than 1 year. And I would say, looking at an existing location, try and do a walk around with someone that's knowledgeable about the particular location and the operations of it. So for a station, it might be the station manager, for example, bridge operator, or the landowner, to understand what has actually been happening, because you get so much more of an understanding from what's going on the ground. And also try and involve a multi-agency approach. So it might be that there are experts around infrastructure or design that can support on that. A good example is the British Transport Police have designing out crime advisors who advise around suicide prevention measures on the railway. That's a good example of how you can look at things in the round, really. Before a scheme is put in, I think just bring in someone that has experience of suicide prevention and just talk to them about the considerations that you need to have ahead of putting in a scheme. I think that you can design those things in from the outset. I mean, the risk factors will be drawn from the community, so it might be that there may be some things that are significant risks local to your scheme. So if there's a mental health hospital right next door or something like that, or a homeless shelter, they could be, you consider those as added risks to a particular location as well.
Thank you. And a further question is looking at what is the best ways of raising awareness for suicide prevention measures in the design project?
So is this in terms of like to stakeholders that are involved in that design?
Yeah, let's take it that way to begin with. Yeah, so perhaps as from a consultancy point of view, or as a designer point of view, how would you raise awareness to a client, and then perhaps we could segue to, as individuals, what have you got any tips that we could use as part of perhaps attending a multidisciplinary design meetings or something like that?
Yeah, I think for the first point, I would say that drawing on existing data is really important. I mean, your scheme won't have a history of suicide if it's a new build, but there might be, you can draw on local statistics for that borough, or what the suicide situation is there, and also equivalent schemes elsewhere. So if you, for example, if you're doing a bridge scheme, you could look at other suicides on bridges and talk to the clients about what those risks might be. And actually, if you're designing in from the outset, you might not be necessarily having to do any additional work at this point to design out suicide. It might just be a case that you take those measures into account when you're building for something. From the other point of view, building in awareness in a sort of multi-agency way. I've been involved in some local authority suicide prevention groups that have been where we've looked at very specific sites, and there's lots of things you can do. I mean, I was involved in a project we call community outreach, And this focused on identifying sites that were of concern, looking at the statistics in a much more localized way. And rather than we looked at those national statistics earlier around men in the middle years, trying to break that down further and seeing what are the drivers of suicide. So it might be that there's a very specific social or health issue in that location that's contributing to suicide, or a different demographic to one that is normally associated with suicide. Then doing some targeted measures around that. So, for example, one I'm thinking of in particular was in West London, where there was a particularly big Asian population, where suicide had a particular stigma that wasn't really talked about. And so it's about inviting volunteers from Samaritans and other organisations in to the local temples and community groups, and talking to them in their own way, and really focusing on what the issues were there, and trying to support help and promoting awareness of what support was out there to groups that didn't historically access it, and trying to build partnerships between existing service providers and those groups. It might be that there are sort of referral opportunities. We ran road shows, we did awareness days at the location and so on. And so it's trying to do things in different ways to reach people that are at risk, but also bringing in different organisations. So it might be a mental health organisation, it might be a substance misuse organisation, it might be debt counsellors, that type of thing. Whatever the local issues are, trying to bring those people together to support local communities around those risk sites.
Excellent, thank you. Just opportunity if anyone's got any last questions to join us there. We've had a message from just to remind us that there's a very powerful article in the recent CIWEM Environment magazine by Hannah, one of my former colleagues, just reflecting on her own mental health journey, with some links to again the Samaritans and some other resources. So please do have a look for that. It's also available online. And also, just as a reminder, that all our webinars are recorded and they should be made available afterwards. So if you've been if you found this webinar very useful and informative, please do refer your colleagues to it, and help spread the message of the importance of acting on suicide prevention and incorporating it into design. I just wanted to reflect back on a couple of the statistics that Neil brought to our attention. I think it was over 5,500 people a year in England and Wales take their own life, and approximately 30% of those do so in a public space. So as people who have an influence or know people who have an influence on the design of public spaces, it really is a great opportunity to help do something about that and incorporate it. I know certainly in my organisation, we start every meeting with a health and safety moment, and I will be raising the issue of suicide prevention and how we could consider that in our designs and our schemes as my moment for the next few months as I work my way through various meetings. So it's definitely something I think we could all act on. And thank you, Neil, for equipping us with some of the ideas there. I thought the combination of physical sort of hard engineering, soft engineering barriers. I really like the idea of the gorse planting, particularly around the edges, to direct people, the signage, and particularly as well that, you know, how they all link together with the hatched areas. You know, I'm very aware of that, particularly in a station and a railway setting. I guess my final question for you is are there aspects of industry, you know, looking at rail or road or other water environment, that are really leading the way in how they engage with suicide prevention, and you know, who we should be looking towards, and you know, what can we do to follow in their footsteps?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously my experience is particularly from the railway, and it's a really well-funded program. So they've been able to take on a really mature program now. It's been going for over 10 years, and it's really well funded by Network Rail, and it pulls together a whole industry, you know, the train companies, British Transport Police and Network Rail, to do something holistically. They've trained tens of thousands of people in suicide prevention. They've got signs up at all their risk locations. They've got they've got, you know, dedicated staff within Network Rail doing suicide prevention, as well as a partnership team of Samaritans of about 13 staff. So that's, I would say that's probably right up there as a gold standard. Harry's England have done a lot of work as well. They've got a really sort of good suicide prevention strategy. So places that got those sorts of networks are really good. I would say those are probably the key ones in the UK. I think Port of London are doing a bit of work as well, actually, for those of you that work, you know, around the Thames. They've done quite a lot of awareness and things as well. So they're a good one as well.
I think what I've always been particularly impressed with Network Rail is their reflection on how suicide impacts on their staff, and particularly, you know, train operators as well, because you know, you mentioned a particular means I won't go into again, but that can be extremely traumatic for the driver as well as the family and the crew and the engineers involved in servicing trains afterwards. And just thinking about not just the individuals that we might be able to support and help protect, but also our staff, our future operators of the places we designed, and how we can help support them in not having to experience that trauma as well.
Definitely, I think there's a range of support services around those suicides where there are people that are affected, and at locations of concern where there's multiple suicides a year, you know, it can be really impactful on the people that are staffing those locations and all the response teams, you know, the emergency services that go out to them on multiple occasions. And I think giving managers that manage those staff the tools to understand trauma and look after them is really important, because that isn't probably why they signed up for that job, and they weren't expecting to get exposed to that kind of thing. So I think it's really important to look after those staff. And as I said earlier, if you have witnessed or been impacted by suicide, you are obviously at greater risk yourself. So we can reduce that trauma, we can reduce suicide as well.
Okay, well, let me just thank Neil again, and Barbara, who's joined us on the camera as well, who's very kindly organised all the technical goings on and sent out all the invites for everyone. So thank you, Neil, for volunteering your time for that. Thank you, Barbara, as well, for, as ever, setting everything up and hosting for us. Hope to join you all again soon in one of the future CIWEM upcoming events. Please do keep an eye out on the events page and on the training pages for the opportunities there for another one of our webinars. Thank you all, and hope to speak to you all soon.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you to Jack and Barbara as well for setting it all up.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you, Jack. It's been a very informative talk and thought-provoking as well.